My name is something I've spent a long time rebuilding. But today, who I am matters far less than what I'm about to show you. The envelope arrived on a rainy Thursday morning in late October. I know it was a Thursday because the air smelled heavily of wet asphalt and I was sitting at my small oak dining table holding a mug of coffee that had gone completely lukewarm while I stared out the window. It was exactly 9:14 a.m. I know that because later on, when the world had completely flipped on its axis, I went back and watched the timestamp on my porch security camera footage over and over again. Just a routine delivery. A delivery driver in a yellow poncho, a quick knock, and a slide through the mail slot. Inside was a heavy, textured, certified package from the law offices of Vance, Sterling, and Associates. It was a formal notification stating that the primary corporate holdings and the entire private estate of Arthur Vance, my father, who had passed away 6 weeks prior, had been legally restructured. According to the document in my hands, my name had been entirely removed from the succession plan of the family architecture firm. I had been left with exactly zero. No shares, no properties, no family history, nothing. Take a sip of whatever you're drinking right now. Sit back and just let that settle for a second. If you have ever had to sit across a room from people who share your blood but treat you like an administrative error, I want you to type the word boundaries right now down in the comments. Seriously, let's create a space for those of us who know what it feels like. Because what my family didn't realize when they slid that letter through my door is that there is a massive, life-altering difference between silence and surrender. They looked at my quiet nature. They looked at the fact that I didn't scream or make a scene at the hospital, and they assumed I was simply going to lie down and let them erase me. They mistook my calm for compliance. But I'm an architect by trade, just like my dad was. And if there is one thing an architect knows how to do, it's how to look at a blueprint and find the exact load-bearing pillar that, if pulled, brings the entire house down. My father built spaces for a living. He spent 40 years designing beautiful sweeping structures for strangers all over the country, buildings meant to withstand storms, earthquakes, and the passage of time. But the tragedy of his life, and the great irony of this story, is that while he knew exactly how to reinforce a foundation out in the world, he had absolutely no idea how to protect his own home from the human manipulation happening right inside it. He was a man of quiet genius, but his kindness made him soft where he needed to be steel. And that brings us to the real architect of my pain. My stepmother, Clara. Clara was a woman of flawless, terrifying elegance. She didn't yell. She didn't throw tantrums. She destroyed you with a polite smile while pouring you a second cup of tea. For the 7 years she was married to my father, she curated a public image that was absolutely pristine. If you looked at her social media pages, you would see beautifully lit photographs of family dinners, accompanied by captions like, "Family is our blueprint," or "Building memories together." Always. She was highly active in the community, revered by the local country club, and praised by our neighbors for her absolute devotion to my father as his health began to decline. But behind closed doors, away from the camera lenses and the community praise, Clara was running a completely different set of calculations. She was a master of subtle isolation. Over those 7 years, I watched her slowly, methodically change the locks on my father's life. It started small, suggesting he cut back on phone calls to preserve his energy, accidentally forgetting to invite me to weekend brunches, and quietly stepping into the role of his sole gatekeeper. I didn't fight her openly back then, mostly because my father was frail, and I refused to turn his remaining time on Earth into a battlefield. I chose to provide genuine, quiet care in the shadows while Clara performed her care in the spotlight. But while I was sitting in those quiet hospital rooms, holding his hand when the cameras weren't rolling, I was also watching. I was taking mental notes. I was reading between the lines of every single interaction. And as I sat there on that rainy Thursday morning, looking at the certified letter that stripped me of my heritage, I realized the time for quiet observation was officially over. The game had begun, and Clara had no idea that I already knew exactly how she played. To understand how a family arrives at the point of stealing a child's entire inheritance, you have to look at the blueprints of how that family was built. My father was a man who lived in his mind. He could look at a blank plot of land and instantly see the structural skeleton of a 20-story building. He understood tension, balance, and the physics of materials. But when it came to human nature, he was entirely defenseless. He assumed everyone operated with the same quiet integrity that he did. He believed a handshake was a binding contract, and he believed that when someone said, "I love you," it meant they were willing to protect you. Clara understood this vulnerability perfectly. She didn't enter his life like a wrecking ball. She entered like a slow, undetected foundation leak. When she first married my father, she immediately set out to redesign the social landscape of our lives. She was highly intelligent, and she knew that the easiest way to push someone out of a business and an estate is to first push them out of the narrative. She began by taking over the administrative side of my father's life. "Arthur, darling, you need to focus on your designs," she would say at the dinner table, her voice dripping with a calculated, honeyed sweetness. "Let me handle the billing, the scheduling, and the family calendar. You just create." It sounded like a gift. It sounded like devotion, but as an architect, I knew exactly what she was doing. She was cutting off his visibility. If you control the calendar, you control who gets in the room. If you control the mail, you control what information enters the house. I remember visiting their house on a Sunday afternoon, about 3 years into their marriage. I had brought over some old sketches my father had asked to see. When I walked into his home office, I noticed that the framed photographs of my mother, who had passed away when I was a teenager, and the photos of my own law school and design graduations had been moved. They weren't gone. Clara was far too smart for that. Total erasure causes an immediate argument. Instead, she had relocated them to the lower shelves, behind a massive, expensive vase and several architectural design awards. She had replaced them on his desk with professional, high-gloss photos of herself and my father at a charity gala. When I asked about it, Clara smiled, not a single muscle in her face twitching. "Oh, sweetheart, the dust was getting so bad on those old frames. I'm having them cleaned and reorganized. This layout just flows so much better for your father's clients, don't you think?" That was her superpower. Plausible deniability. If I argued, I looked petty. If I made a scene, I was the dramatic, ungrateful child attacking a woman who was just trying to keep the office clean. So I chose to say nothing. I adjusted the vase slightly so my mother's face was visible again, looked Clara dead in the eye, and said, "The foundation always shows through the paint. Eventually, Clara." She didn't flinch, but her smile hardened by a fraction of a millimeter. Have you ever dealt with a person like that? Someone who undermines you so politely that you find yourself questioning your own sanity? If you know exactly the kind of covert manipulation I'm talking about, do me a favor and drop a thumbs up. Or comment "I see you" below. It helps to know we aren't alone in recognizing these patterns. As my father's business grew, so did Clara's public relations campaign. She positioned herself as the matriarch of the firm, even though she couldn't tell the difference between a load-bearing wall and a drywall partition. She organized the company galas, she handled the press releases when we won major city contracts, and she made sure that every public accolade featured her standing prominently by his side. To the city, to the clients, and to our extended family, she was the anchor keeping Arthur Vance grounded. But I saw the financial statements. Because I handled several project management portfolios for the firm, I began to notice subtle shifts in our corporate architecture. Small consulting fees being paid to ambiguous marketing firms that didn't seem to have a physical address. Changes in the corporate bylaws regarding voting shares in the event of a majority partner's medical incapacitation. Clara was quietly pouring concrete around her own positioning, ensuring that when the time came, she wouldn't just be a beneficiary. She would be the sole dictator of the estate. She thought I was too busy looking at blueprints to notice the fine print of the financial ledgers. She was very, very wrong. As the calendar flipped into the final year of my father's life, the elegant illusion Clara had built began to harden into a cold reality. My father's health began to fail him rapidly in the spring. It wasn't a sudden, dramatic collapse, but rather a slow, agonizing theft of his vitality. The man who used to pace across construction sites with boundless energy was suddenly confined to a motorized leather chair in his study, surrounded by the ghosts of his past designs. And it was during this dark period that the two entirely separate layers of care in our household became blindingly obvious. Clara's version of caregiving was entirely performative. It was a production designed for an audience. When the local architecture guild or our high-profile corporate clients sent flowers to the house, Clara would magically appear at the front door, wearing a perfectly tailored black dress that practically screamed dignified sorrow. She would take photos of herself reading to him by the window, her face caught in a soft, melancholic beam of sunlight, and those photos would inevitably find their way into the country club newsletter within 48 hours. She made sure everyone knew exactly how heavy her cross was to bear. But my version of care happened when the sun went down and the world was completely dark. It happened in the terrifying, unglamorous hours of the night when there was no one around to applaud. I was the one who drove 3 hours in the middle of a torrential downpour because his home oxygen machine had flashed a warning code and Clara had turned her phone on silent to preserve her mental health. I was the one who sat on the edge of his bed at 3 a.m., holding a cold washcloth to his forehead while his body shivered with fever, gently whispering to him that he was safe. I sorted his pills into those cheap, plastic Monday through Sunday organizers, meticulously cross-checking his prescription because Clara's assistants kept forgetting the dosages. I remember one night vividly. It was a Tuesday, around 3:30 in the morning. The house was completely silent except for the rhythmic, mechanical hum of his oxygen concentrator. Clara was asleep in the master wing on the other side of the estate. My father suddenly opened his eyes. For a second, the fog of his medications seemed to lift, and his gaze became incredibly sharp, incredibly present. He reached out with a trembling hand, gripped my wrist with surprising strength, and pulled me close. "They see a property, sweetheart," he whispered, his voice incredibly raspy but entirely steady. "You see me. Never forget the difference." That memory, that tiny 70-word exchange, became the anchor for everything that followed. It was a parasitic thought that lived inside my mind, constantly pulling me back to the truth whenever the family drama threatened to overwhelm me. He knew. Despite the isolation, despite the medicine, he saw the chessboard perfectly. I want to pause here and ask you a real question. Have you ever noticed how the people who do the absolute least in private always feel the need to act like they're doing the absolute most in public? If you've ever watched a family member play the martyr for an audience while you quietly carried the actual structural weight of the crisis, type the word truth in the comments. Let me know I'm not the only one who has lived through that specific kind of exhausting, agonizing hypocrisy. While I was carrying that weight, Clara was busy finalizing her corporate maneuvers. She had hired a new medical consultant for the household, a doctor who happened to be a close personal friend of her estate planning attorney. Every time I tried to ask about the specific medical trajectory or requested copies of his cognitive evaluations, Clara would intercept the emails. "Oh, honey, you're already working so hard on the city park project," she would say, patting my arm with a hand that felt like ice. "Let me carry the medical burden. It's too emotional for you." I didn't argue. I didn't scream at her. Instead, I went back to my desk, opened an encrypted digital folder on my laptop, and began documenting every single interaction. I saved every ignored text message, every intercepted email, every medication log I had personally filled out, and every single calendar entry where I had provided night watch care. I wasn't acting out of anger. I was acting out of historical accuracy. I knew that in a world ruled by people like Clara, an emotion is completely worthless, but a time-stamped receipt is a lethal weapon. The human body can endure an incredible amount of emotional pressure before it finally hits its breaking point. For me, that breaking point didn't happen during the long, agonizing nights in the hospital room, nor did it happen when my father drew his final, quiet breath on a Tuesday morning in September. It happened 5 days later, at his funeral. That was the day Clara decided to make our internal power dynamic completely public. I learned about my father's passing through a phone call from the head of our firm's drafting department. Clara hadn't even called me from the hospital. She had left that administrative task to a middle manager. And when I picked up the local newspaper the next morning, my hands trembling as I unfolded the sheets, my eyes blurred over the text of his official obituary. It was a beautiful tribute, spanning half a page, detailing his legacy, his awards, and his impact on the city's skyline. It prominently listed his surviving family: his devoted wife, Clara Vance, her brother, her nieces, and even the family's primary legal advisor. My name was completely absent from the text. I didn't exist. I had been systematically edited out of his life story, a clean and clinical deletion designed to signal to the entire community that I was no longer part of the Vance legacy. I want you to think about that for a second. Imagine opening a newspaper and seeing the life of the person who raised you, the person you cared for in the dark, summarized for the world, while your relationship to them is treated like a typo. If you have ever felt that sickening, hollow ache of being intentionally erased by the people who were supposed to protect you, type the word "visible" in the comments right now. Let's remind each other that our value isn't determined by someone else's broken narrative. When the day of the funeral arrived, I wore my sharpest charcoal suit. I didn't arrive crying, I arrived composed. But as I walked down the stone aisle of the church, heading toward the front pews where the immediate family traditionally sits, a hand firmly gripped my shoulder. It was one of Clara's high-priced corporate event coordinators. She gave me a tight, superficial smile that didn't reach her eyes and whispered, "Oh, sweetheart, the front rows are fully reserved for the executive board, the VIP city officials, and Clara's immediate party. We've set aside a lovely spot for you in the back." She pointed toward the secondary rows, near the heavy wooden exit doors, far away from the flowers, far away from the coffin, and completely out of sight of the cameras. I looked past her and saw Clara sitting in the center of the front pew. She was veiled in exquisite black lace, surrounded by local politicians and wealthy developers, holding a lace handkerchief to her eye. She wasn't crying. She was performing. She caught my gaze for a brief fraction of a second through her veil, and her posture straightened. It was a deliberate, calculated test. She wanted me to cause a scene, She wanted the estranged, emotional child to throw a tantrum at her father's funeral so she could use it as definitive proof that I was unstable and unfit to be part of the family business. In that exact moment, a profound, icy stillness washed over me. My heart rate slowed down to a steady, rhythmic beat. I felt my hands go completely flat and steady at my sides. My grief didn't vanish, it simply transformed. It changed from a chaotic, heavy sorrow into an analytical, unbreakable clarity. I realized that reacting with anger was exactly what she had budgeted for. Anger is messy. Anger is predictable. But absolute, unbothered calm? That is a terrifying variable for a manipulator. "Thank you," I said to the coordinator, my voice completely level, devoid of any anger or resentment. The back row suits me perfectly. I've always preferred to have a full view of the entire structure. I walked to the very back of the church, sat down by the exit doors, and took out a small, leather-bound notebook from my jacket pocket. While the choir sang and Clara wiped away her invisible tears for the photographers, I sat quietly and began mapping out the structural vulnerabilities of the woman sitting in the front row. I watched who leaned in to whisper to her. I noted which city council members shook her hand with particular familiarity. I looked at the legal team surrounding her like a fortress. They thought they were burying my father and putting me in my place. They had no idea that from my view in the back row, I was quietly taking measurements for their demolition. The weeks following the funeral were a masterclass in calculated silence. Clara expected a lawsuit. She had her legal team on retainer, waiting for me to file a frantic, emotional challenge to the revised estate documents. She expected angry phone calls, late-night texts, or dramatic confrontations at the firm's headquarters. But I gave her absolutely nothing. I went back to my desk, opened my design software, and worked my normal hours. I maintained complete radio silence. When you don't feed a fire with oxygen, the person who started it begins to get frantic, wondering why it isn't burning the way they planned. Instead of making noise, I hired a forensic estate specialist named Marcus Vance. No relation to us. Just a brilliant, stone-cold legal mind who spent his life dismantling corporate fraud. I brought him the encrypted digital folder I had been maintaining during my father's illness. "Clara thinks she played a perfect game," Marcus told me as we sat in his dimly lit office, surrounded by stacks of financial ledgers. But people who rely on illusions always leave footprints. They're so focused on the public performance that they forget the digital trail. Together, we began a quiet, forensic audit of the timeline surrounding my father's asset transfers. And what we uncovered was a textbook example of predatory corporate architecture. Exactly 14 days after my father's heavy neurological medication dosage had been doubled by that newly appointed household doctor, Clara had established an offshore shell company called Meridian Design Holdings, LLC. Through a series of complex, backdated administrative maneuvers, she had transferred 85% of my father's personal voting shares in the architecture firm directly into this shell company. She had assumed that because I was a designer, I would only look at the aesthetic blueprints of the business, not the corporate framework beneath it. She thought the labyrinth of shell corporations would shield her from any scrutiny. She didn't realize that a blueprint is a blueprint, whether it's drawn in concrete or corporate law. I want to stop right here and speak directly to you. Have you ever had to sit entirely still, keeping your mouth completely shut, while you quietly documented the absolute truth about someone who was lying straight to your face? If you've ever had to bide your time and build your case in absolute silence, while the other person thought they were winning, type the word receipts right now in the comments. Let me know you understand the power of waiting for the perfect moment. Every day, Clara would send out corporate-wide emails from my father's old account, signing them with his digital signature, keeping up the illusion that he had been fully operational until his final moments. But my forensic specialist was tracking the IP addresses. Those signatures weren't coming from my father's study or his hospital room. Every single one of them was traced directly to Clara's personal laptop, sent while she was sitting at the country club or lounging in the master wing of the estate. We gathered the medical logs, the pharmacy dispensing records, the IP tracking data, and the explicit testimonies from the night shift nurses who recalled Clara ordering them to leave the room whenever her estate attorney visited. Page by page, document by document, Marcus and I compiled a file set that was nearly 4 inches thick. I didn't send a warning shot. I didn't have my attorney draft a threatening letter. I simply let the volume of evidence sit securely in my safe deposit box. I wanted Clara to feel completely secure. I wanted her to believe that her back row exile of me had worked flawlessly, that I was defeated, broken, and compliant. Because when a person thinks they have completely won the game, they stop looking at the board. They relax their posture. They invite you right into their space, completely unaware that they've just walked directly into a checkmate they never saw coming. The trap was finally set, but it wasn't set by me. It was set by Clara, wrapped in the guise of family reconciliation. 3 weeks after the forensic file was completed, the invitation arrived. It wasn't a certified letter this time. It was a beautifully styled, textured card delivered via a private courier. Clara was hosting a mandatory family dinner at the primary Vance estate. The card stated that it was time to amicably finalize the transitional affairs of Arthur's brilliant legacy and secure the future of the family as one. When I walked through the heavy mahogany front doors of my childhood home that Tuesday evening, the atmosphere felt less like a dinner and more like a corporate deposition. The air was thick with the scent of expensive catering and cold ambition. Clara had arranged the seating around the grand dining table with clinical precision. She sat at the head, looking radiant and entirely untouchable in a cream-colored silk blouse. To her right sat her brother, Julian, a man who possessed all of Clara's arrogance, but none of her intellect. To her left was her primary estate planning attorney, Mr. Sterling, who had his leather briefcase resting flat on the antique sideboard. My younger brother, Leo, who had flown in from Chicago, sat near the end of the table. He looked entirely miserable, his eyes glued to his phone, refusing to make eye contact with anyone. Leo had always chosen the path of least resistance. He knew Clara was tearing the family apart, but he had stayed quiet for years to protect his own corporate allowance. The dinner itself was an exercise in pure psychological theater. Clara talked extensively about what Arthur would have wanted. She spoke about preserving the firm's public reputation and ensuring that my father's name remained associated with prestige. She poured the wine, passed the porcelain dishes, and smiled with that same terrifying, unblenching politeness that had defined her entire marriage to my father. I sat quietly, ate my food, and listened. I asked no questions. I offered no resistance. I let her believe she was entirely in control of the room. Once the dessert plates were cleared, the true purpose of the evening was placed on the table. Mr. Sterling stood up, opened his briefcase, and slid a multi-page legal document across the polished wood toward me. "As you know," Clara began, her voice dropping into a tone of gentle maternal concern that made my skin crawl. "Your father restructured the firm's shares to ensure long-term corporate stability. However, because I want to ensure you feel valued as part of this family, I have instructed Mr. Sterling to authorize a special discretionary gift for you." She gestured toward the document. It was a corporate liability waiver coupled with a payout agreement. in exchange for signing away any and all future rights to contest the restructuring of the firm and waiving my claims to my father's personal estate. Clara was offering me a lump sum of exactly $10,000. It was an insulting, calculated pittance, a tiny fraction of what my father had spent 40 years building. "It's a very generous accommodation, sweetheart," Clara whispered, leaning forward, her eyes scanning my face for any sign of cracking composure. "We just want to avoid any messy public drama. It's what your father would have wanted for the peace of this family. I hope you aren't going to choose to be difficult." Julian chuckled softly from his side of the table, crossing his arms. "Take the deal," he said loudly. "Lawyers are expensive, and a prolonged dispute won't look good on your resume when you're looking for a new firm to hire you." I looked down at the paper. I looked at the signature line, waiting for my ink. The room held its breath, waiting for the outburst they had budgeted for. They expected me to throw the waiver, to scream about the injustice, or to storm out of the house in tears. They had built an entire legal defense around my anger. They had no idea that I hadn't brought an ounce of anger into the room with me. I had brought something infinitely more destructive to their plans. I reached into my briefcase, pulled out a fountain pen, and let a long, slow silence fill the dining room. I didn't pick up the waiver. I didn't touch their pen. Instead, I let my hands rest completely flat on the polished mahogany table, feeling the coldness of the wood beneath my palms. I looked at Clara, then at Mr. Sterling, and finally at my brother Leo, who was still staring fixedly at his hands. The silence stretched out, growing heavier with every passing second, until Julian shifted uncomfortably in his chair, the confidence slowly draining from his face. "May I have the floor for just a moment?" I asked, my voice entirely level, echoing softly in the cavernous dining room. Clara waved her hand with a patronizing, elegant gesture. "Of course, sweetheart. We're all family here. Say what you need to say." I reached into my leather briefcase and took out a single, neatly bound document. It wasn't a lawsuit. It wasn't an emotional letter. I slid it across the table, watching it glide smoothly over the wood until it tapped gently against Mr. Sterling's silver water glass. "What is this?" the attorney asked, his brow furrowing as he pulled the document toward him and adjusted his reading glasses. "That," I said, leaning back slightly and crossing my legs, "is a certified copy of the irrevocable look-back trust established by Arthur Vance in June of 2018. It was drafted and executed by an independent maritime and corporate law firm in Delaware, entirely outside of your local network, Mr. Sterling." Clara's smile didn't vanish, but the corners of her mouth twitched. "Arthur updated his estate plans completely last month, honey. Whatever old documents you have are entirely irrelevant now." "That's where your architectural miscalculation lies, Clara," I said, keeping my tone perfectly conversational, like a professor explaining a basic formula to a freshman class. "You see, you spent the last 2 years focusing entirely on the will and the internal corporate bylaws of the primary architecture firm. You assumed that by altering the voting shares while my father was under heavy sedation, you could bypass the succession plan. But you didn't look at the foundation underneath the house." Mr. Sterling's face had gone completely, strikingly pale. His fingers trembled slightly as he turned to page 18 of the document. "An irrevocable look-back trust," I continued, directing my gaze straight at Clara, "is legally non-amendable. My father established it when his mind was perfectly clear, years before you ever introduced him to your personal medical consultant. And it contains a very specific, ironclad fail-safe clause. It explicitly states that if any attempt is made to restructure, transfer, or dilute the corporate assets of the Vance firm while the primary founder is under active, high-dosage cognitive care, those transfers are automatically rendered null and void ab initio. The law views them as if they never happened. The room became so quiet you could hear the rain outside striking the window panes. Furthermore, I added, taking a deep breath and letting the weight of my words settle over the table. The trust dictates that in the event of such an unauthorized, medicated manipulation, 100% of the executive voting shares and the entirety of the real property assets instantly revert, not to the estate, but directly to me as the sole designated trustee. By executing those backdated transfers from your personal laptop while my father was incapacitated, you didn't secure the company for yourself, Clara. You legally triggered the trapdoor that strips you of everything. Clara stood up so fast. Her dining chair scraped violently against the hardwood floor. The elegant manicured illusion she had maintained for 7 years shattered in a single second. Her face contorted into something tight, sharp, and furious. "This is a fabrication. Your father loved me. He wanted me to have the firm. You've manipulated these documents." "The forensic file is already with the probate court, Clara," I said, my voice remaining entirely calm, a stark contrast to her rising panic. "We have the IP addresses tracking every digital signature to your laptop. We have the nursing logs showing when your attorney visited during his sedation hours. And we have the drug interaction reports from his pharmacy. The foundation you built your plan on wasn't load-bearing. And tonight, it just completely collapsed." Julian opened his mouth to shout something, but Mr. Sterling placed a heavy hand on his arm, slowly shaking his head. The attorney looked up at me, his eyes filled with a grim professional defeat. He knew the legal architecture was flawless. He knew the game was over. I didn't stay to watch Clara scream at her attorney, nor did I stay to listen to Julian's loud, empty threats as they echoed down the grand hallway. I simply stood up, fastened the single button of my charcoal suit jacket, placed my fountain pen back into my briefcase, and walked out of that house for the final time. As the heavy mahogany front doors clicked shut behind me, the cool, rain-washed night air hit my face, and for the first time in 6 months, my chest didn't feel constricted by the heavy weight of sorrow. The truth was out in the open, and the architecture of their lie had folded under its own illegal weight. The legal aftermath was swift and completely definitive. Clara's high-priced defense team spent 48 days trying to find a single fracture, a single loophole, or a minor technicality within the irrevocable look-back trust. They found absolutely nothing. The probate judge reviewed our 4-inch thick file, the IP tracking data, the explicit nursing logs, and the chronological medication records, and issued a summary dismissal order without even granting Clara a formal hearing. The judge's final written order contained a brief, devastating assessment that permanently sealed the case. The execution of the 2018 trust represents a complete, unambiguous expression of the testator's intent, entirely insulated from subsequent manipulation. The trust dispersed every single asset exactly as my father had planned when his mind was perfectly clear. The corporate shares of the architecture firm, the historical blueprints, and the primary accounts were transferred entirely into my name. Clara was left with nothing but the remaining $10,000 she had tried to use to buy my silence, and her brother Julian was completely stripped of his corporate titles within 48 hours. But I didn't keep the money to buy a larger house, and I didn't step into the executive office to play the role of a vengeful dictator. That would have meant operating on the same low financial frequency that Clara lived on. Instead, I liquidated the primary corporate holding blocks and used the assets to establish a permanent, fully funded institution at our city's design academy, the Arthur Vance Memorial Architecture and Urban Clinic. It is a space that provides completely free structural consulting, blueprint reviews, and legal estate protection for elderly property owners and underprivileged students who don't have the resources to fight a family with a predatory plan. My brother Leo called me about 8 weeks after the dismissal. His voice on the phone sounded smaller than usual, stripped of the comfortable, lazy indifference he had used as a shield for years. He told me he was deeply sorry. He admitted that he had seen Clara slowly isolating our father, and that he had chosen to stay quiet simply because it was easier, safer, and kept his allowance intact. He didn't offer any cheap excuses. I listened to him completely. I told him that I appreciated his honesty, and that while I wasn't ready to invite him back into the center of my life just yet, I had heard his words. Healing isn't a sudden event. It's a slow, deliberate construction project. I want to look at you one last time as we finish this lukewarm cup of coffee together. If this story reminded you that the person who never makes a public scene is not the person you should underestimate, I want you to hold on to that truth tightly. If it reminded you that providing genuine, consistent care in the dark is always noticed, even when the rest of the world is busy applauding a loud, performative lie, keep that close to your heart, too. My father never confused my quietness with compliance. He knew that when the storm finally hit the house, I would be the one standing steady at the foundation, holding the blueprint he left behind. Silence isn't a sign of weakness, my friends. It is an incubation period for your strategy. If you are currently navigating a dark family storm, stay completely calm. Keep gathering your receipts, and let the clinical weight of the truth do the heavy lifting for you. Hit that subscribe button if you are choosing peace over dramatic chaos. Drop your final thoughts below, and I will see you in the very next story time. Take care of yourselves.